and welcome to our viewers joining us here in the United States and all around the world. You are watching CNN Newsroom, and I'm Rosemary Church. Just ahead, 60 days from Election Day, and the president suggesting his supporters break the law. Why Donald Trump says people should consider trying to vote twice. The US CDC says states should prepare for a possible coronavirus vaccine as soon as October, but is there real hope of a safe and effective vaccine by then? And in a CNN exclusive, Attorney General William Barr confirms Russia is trying to meddle in the election again, but he says China is the worst offender. Good to have you with us. Well, with 60 days to go until the US election and a new wave of polls showing a tightening race, the US President Donald Trump is suggesting it would be okay if voters tried to vote twice, a potential criminal act. He made the remark on Wednesday in North Carolina. As he explained it, a voter could submit a ballot by mail and then try to vote again in person in case their mail-in ballot had not yet been counted. In North Carolina, that might be a felony. Here's how he framed it.
They're going to have to go and check their vote by going to the poll and voting that way, because if it tabulates, then they won't be able to do that. So let them send it in and let them go vote. And if their system's as good as they say it is, then obviously they won't be able to vote. The absentees are fine. We have to work to get them, it means something. And you send them in, but you go to vote. And if they haven't counted it, you can vote.
President Trump and his Democratic challenger Joe Biden are taking widely divergent approaches to several issues, including the ongoing protests over racial injustice. The president is now threatening to withhold federal funds to some cities, claiming the Democratic leaders there are allowing anarchy, violence, and destruction. By contrast, Biden will travel to Kenosha, Wisconsin today to hold a community meeting after the controversial police shooting of a black man there and the protests it ignited. Biden explained what he would do differently if he were president.
I'd be bringing people together in the White House right now. I'd be having that police commission set up. I'd have law enforcement at the table. I'd have the community at the table. I'd have people and saying, how do we get through this? What do we do to deal with this? Because I believe the vast majority of the community at writ large, as well as law enforcement, want to straighten things out, not inflame things. But this president keeps throwing gasoline in the fire every place he goes.
And while many Americans regard the recent police shootings of black men and women as evidence of systemic racism, the country's top law enforcement official does not share that view. Here's what U.S. Attorney General William Barr told our Wolf Blitzer in an exclusive interview.
You think black people are treated differently by law enforcement than white people?
I think there are some situations where statistics which suggest that they are treated differently, but I don't think that that's necessarily racism. To me, the word systemic means that it's built into the institution. And I don't think that's true. I think our institutions have been reformed in the past 60 years, and if anything has been built in, it's a bias to non-discrimination. I do think that there appears to be a phenomenon in the country where African Americans feel that they're treated, when they're stopped by police frequently, as suspects before they're treated as citizens. I don't think that that necessarily reflects some deep-seated racism in police departments or in most police officers. Well, I'm not going to talk about the Blake case.
Why not?
Because I think it's different than the Floyd case.
What's different?
Well, Floyd was already subdued, incapacitated, in handcuffs, and was not armed. In the Jacob case, he was in the midst of committing a felony, and he was armed. It's very easy to maintain peace in these cities. In any city where the mayor backs the police chief is doing his job, and the governor is willing to provide backup support, there will be peace on the streets, and there has been peace.
Barr also railed against mail-in ballots in the upcoming election, even though it's been widely used for years. Take a listen.
So far, we haven't seen widespread fraud. But
So far, we haven't tried it.
Well,
and the point
there's
is,
been a lot of us. There are several states that only have mail-in voting, including a Republican
well,
state
this
like
is
Utah.
playing with fire. This is playing with fire. We're a very closely divided country here. And if people have to have confidence in the results of the election and the legitimacy of the government, and people trying to change the rules to this methodology, which, as a matter of logic, is very open to fraud and coercion, is reckless and dangerous. And the people are playing with fire.
Well, I will point out there are 5 states that only have mail-in voting, including Utah and Colorado, Washington State, Oregon, Hawaii, and they've reported over the years they've had virtually no problems. But who's trying to change the rules right now?
I would say the people who want to go to mass mail-in ballots.
But you understand why. There is a coronavirus pandemic,
Right.
and there are a lot of people potentially, if they waited long lines when they go to the polls, and they could get sick, especially older people or people with underlying conditions. As a result, a lot of people want to change the rules so they don't have to go wait in
Right,
long
and people-
lines.
well,
they don't have to touch all this.
And the appropriate way to deal with that is, number one, arrangements at the polls that protect people, which can be done. And number two, people who have pre-existing conditions and are particularly vulnerable can get an absentee ballot. I have no problem with people. I voted by absentee ballot, not by mail. I actually went to the office to cast my vote, but absentee ballots are fine.
During your tenure as Attorney General of the United States, how many indictments have you brought against people committing voter fraud?
I couldn't tell you off the top of my head, but several I know of.
Like a handful?
I can't, I don't know.
But several doesn't sound like too many.
Well, I don't know. I don't know how many we have.
Do you accept that Russia is once again interfering in the U.S. presidential election?
I accept that there's some preliminary activity that suggests that they might try again.
Joining me now is Harry Enton, a senior political writer and analyst for CNN Politics and an expert on poll numbers and electoral trends. Good to have you with us.
My pleasure.
So new CNN polling done right after the DNC and RNC came out Wednesday afternoon showing nationally Democratic presidential nominee Joe Biden still ahead by 8 points, 51 to 43. But of course, it's the Electoral College that determines the winner. So how do you interpret these numbers and the state breakdowns?
Yeah, sure. So, look, this is essentially where we were right before the convention. So the idea that the conventions would be a game changer, not actually true. We see that in a CNN poll. We see that across the polling. But of course, as you point out, it's the Electoral College that ultimately determines who becomes president. We learned that last time, of course, in 2016 when Hillary Clinton won the popular vote, but it was in fact Donald Trump who won the presidency. In our own CNN poll, we did break it down to 15 closest states back from 2016. And what we do see is that Biden's lead is a little bit slimmer there, but he's still up by 5 points. And more than that, there was a bunch of swing state polling that came out on Wednesday, which showed that Joe Biden had a lead in the swing states that he needed to be ahead in. So at this point, I would say, look, the race is probably a little bit closer in the swing states than it is nationally, but Joe Biden is still clearly ahead.
Interesting. And the latest CNN poll also asks what issues worry Americans most and found this: coronavirus 60%, the economy 58%, racism 52%, and crime 37%. And interesting numbers there, given President Trump has desperately tried to make law and order the main election issue when in fact it's the coronavirus. Surprise, surprise. He's trying to divert attention away from the pandemic, which clearly concerns Americans more than anything else. How could the president make such a miscalculation? I mean, presumably he has his own numbers on these issues. And why doesn't he just try to fix the pandemic like other world leaders have done?
Well, the fact that I'm doing this on Cisco perhaps tells you all you need to know about what is most important at this particular point. The fact that we all have to go out wearing masks, or should be going out wearing masks, tells you everything that you need to know. But look, this is what the president does, right? He tries to distract. We've seen this consistently, whether it be through Twitter or his own statements. He sees an issue in which the American public is viewing him as failing and then tries to change it. But here's the whole problem with that. Just because you say something doesn't make it true. And I think this poll number, along with the slew of poll numbers that I've seen consistently through the last few months, indicates that the coronavirus and who is best to handle that pandemic is probably going to win the election. And our own poll does show that Joe Biden leads on the coronavirus.
And Harry, Axios did a piece on the red mirage scenario, essentially showing that on election night, it'll look like Trump has won, but as mail-in votes come in and get counted, it'll start looking more like a Biden win because, of course, as these numbers show, more Democrats choose mail-in voting than in-person voting. What's your response to that? Do you buy into that theory?
Well, I mean, first off, it's not necessarily a surprise that more Democrats say they're going to vote by mail than Republicans, given all the statements that President Trump has made about mail voting, right? Even though the fact is he votes by mail. I buy it to some degree, but not necessarily to the degree that perhaps Axios tries to sell it. Look, it is true that in some states the mail-in votes will be counted later. So, I would expect that Biden's lead, if he does have one after Election Day, grows. But the fact is that I'm not necessarily convinced that it will be the type of situation where we go to bed on election night thinking one candidate has won and then another candidate ends up winning. What I would suggest to the audience, if you're going to keep your eye on one state to get an understanding of how this election may turn out, it might be the state of Florida, where the absentee ballots or the mail ballots have to be in, with a few exceptions, by Election Day, and they know how to count those ballots fast. If Joe Biden wins in the state of Florida, he is almost certainly going to win this election. If he loses, Trump may have a step up, though it's not necessarily as clear that he would necessarily come out on top.
Great to chat with you. Harry Enton, thanks as always.
My pleasure.
The U.S.